The dust swirled through Deadwood Creek like a living thing, coating everything in the amber glow of late afternoon. The saloon's batwing doors hung open, inviting the desert heat inside where it mixed with the stench of stale whiskey and tobacco smoke. Piano music drifted from within, accompanied by the rough laughter of men who had nothing better to do than drink away another scorching day. Aiyana pressed her back against the storage room wall, her dark eyes fixed on the crude costume hanging from a nail, feathers and beads hastily sewn onto torn fabric, a mockery of her people's sacred regalia. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, not from fear but from the rage that burned in her chest like a coal she couldn't spit out. "Time to earn your keep, girl," came Mayor Thornton's voice through the thin wooden door. His boots clicked against the floorboards as he paced outside. "The boys are getting restless, and you know what happens when they get restless." She knew. She'd seen it happen to others. The Mexican woman who'd refused to sing their songs, the Chinese man who'd spoken back to a customer. Deadwood Creek had its own twisted sense of justice, and Mayor Thornton was its judge and jury. Aiyana pulled the costume over her simple brown dress, each feather feeling like a weight against her soul. 3 months ago she'd been free, living with her grandmother in the mountains, learning the old ways. Then the cavalry had come, and everything changed. Her grandmother's blood had soaked into the earth, while Aiyana was dragged away, sold like livestock to pay for the soldiers' entertainment. The piano stopped abruptly, and Thornton's voice boomed through the saloon. "Gentlemen, for your viewing pleasure, we present our little Apache dancer." The crowd whooped and hollered, their voices a cacophony of drunken anticipation. Aiyana closed her eyes, remembering her grandmother's words. "They can chain your body, child, but your spirit flies free if you let it." She pushed through the door and stepped into the main room. The saloon fell silent except for the creak of wooden chairs and the shuffle of boots. 20 pairs of eyes stared at her. Miners, ranchers, drifters, all united in their hunger for degradation disguised as entertainment. "Well, look at that," sneered Jack Morrison, the town's blacksmith. "Pretty as a picture, ain't she? Even if she is a savage." "Dance, Apache girl," shouted another voice. "Show us how your people used to dance before we civilized this territory." The piano player, a thin man with greasy hair, began a crude approximation of what the townsfolk imagined tribal music sounded like. The melody was wrong, the rhythm foreign to everything sacred in Aiyana's culture, but she had learned not to correct them. Correction brought punishment. She began to move, her feet finding the rhythm despite her soul's rebellion. The men clapped and stamped their feet, their faces flushed with alcohol, and the peculiar satisfaction that came from watching someone else's humiliation. She spun and swayed, her movements a hollow echo of the sacred dances her people had performed for generations. "That's it!" Mayor Thornton called out, his gold tooth glinting in the lamplight. "Show them what savage grace looks like." A newcomer sat in the corner, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing or clapping. His weathered hands rested motionless on the table, wrapped around a half-empty glass of whiskey. Something about his stillness made Aiyana's skin prickle with recognition, though she couldn't place why. The music grew louder, more frantic, and the crowd's jeers intensified. Someone threw a coin at her feet, then another. The metal pieces clinked against the floorboards like chains, each one a reminder of what she'd become. "Come on, Apache girl," Morrison taunted. "Put some fire in it. Show us how your people really danced around their war fires." The stranger's head lifted slightly, and for a moment, Aiyana caught a glimpse of his eyes, blue as winter sky, but carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the entire room. He was older than most of the men present, maybe 40, with the kind of deep lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too much sorrow. As the music reached its crescendo, Aiyana felt something break inside her. The costume's feathers fluttered as she spun, and for a moment she forgot where she was. She was back in the mountains, dancing for the spirits of her ancestors, her grandmother's proud smile warming her like sunlight. But reality crashed back as the crowd's laughter grew louder, crueler. These men didn't see a person expressing her culture. They saw a conquered enemy performing for their amusement. The dance that should have been sacred had become a spectacle, a symbol of their dominance over her people. The stranger stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound cut through the music like a blade, and several heads turned toward him. He was tall, lean, with the kind of presence that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. "That's enough," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low tone. The piano player's fingers stumbled over the keys and the music faltered, Mayor Thornton's face darkened as he studied the newcomer. "Excuse me, friend," Thornton said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "but we're in the middle of our evening entertainment. If you don't care for it, you're welcome to find another establishment." The stranger's eyes never left Aiyana, and she saw something there that made her chest tighten, not pity, but recognition, as if he understood something about her situation that the others couldn't grasp. "I said that's enough," he repeated, stepping away from his table. The saloon had gone completely silent now, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Aiyana stood frozen in the center of the room, still caught between the sacred and the profane, between who she was and what they wanted her to be. Thornton's hand moved to the gun at his hip, and several other men followed suit. The stranger noticed but didn't seem concerned. Instead, he reached into his vest and pulled out a silver dollar, which he flipped onto the piano with a sharp clink. "Play something else," he told the piano player. "Something with dignity." The room erupted in angry murmurs, but the stranger's calm presence held them in check. Aiyana found herself looking into those blue eyes again, and for the first time in 3 months, she didn't feel alone. The silver dollar spun on the piano's scarred surface, catching the lamplight as it wobbled to a stop. The silence stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap. Aiyana remained motionless in the center of the room, her breath shallow, watching the stranger who had dared to challenge the town's twisted entertainment. Mayor Thornton's face had turned the color of dried blood. "Mister, I don't know who you think you are, but Cole Harrison," the stranger said simply, as if his name should mean something. To some in the room, it clearly did. A few of the older men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that spoke of recognition and unease. "Harrison," Thornton's voice trailed off as he studied the man more carefully. "The scout?" Cole nodded once, his expression unchanged. Aiyana watched the dynamics shift in the room like sand in a windstorm. Whatever reputation this man carried, it was enough to make armed men think twice about drawing their weapons. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered Jack Morrison, his earlier bravado evaporating. "Cole Harrison, heard you disappeared after that business up at Apache Canyon." "I did," Cole said, his voice carrying the weight of old wounds. "But I'm here now, and I'm asking you to let the girl go." Thornton's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Let her go. She's property of this establishment, bought and paid for. She owes a debt to this town for room and board, and she'll work it off proper." "What debt?" Cole's question cut through the saloon's thick air like a blade. "The debt of her people," Thornton spat. "The debt of every Apache who's killed good Christian folk, burned homesteads, stolen cattle. She's paying for the sins of her savage race." Cole's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And what about the debts we owe?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Aiyana found herself holding her breath, sensing that something profound was shifting in the room's balance. The stranger, Cole, wasn't just defending her. He was challenging the very foundation of the town's righteousness. "We don't owe nothing to savages," Morrison growled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't we?" Cole stepped closer to the center of the room, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. "What about the children killed in raids? The women and elders slaughtered while their men were away hunting? What about the promises broken, the treaties ignored?" Thornton's hand moved to his gun again. "You're talking like a traitor, Harrison, like an Apache lover. I'm talking like a man who's seen enough killing to know the difference between justice and revenge." Cole's voice remained steady, but Aiyana caught the tremor of old pain beneath it. "And this isn't justice." The piano player, sensing the mood in the room, began to play a slow, melancholy tune, something that sounded almost like a hymn. The change in music seemed to break whatever spell had held the crowd, and several men began to mutter among themselves. "She dances or she doesn't eat," Thornton declared, his authority reasserting itself. "That's the arrangement. She's got no choice in the matter." "Everyone has a choice," Cole said quietly. He looked directly at Aiyana for the first time since the confrontation began, even when it doesn't feel like it. Their eyes met across the smoky room, and Aiyana felt something pass between them. Not romance, but understanding. This man knew something about being trapped between worlds, about carrying the weight of actions that couldn't be undone. "She chooses to dance," Thornton insisted. "Don't you, girl?" All eyes turned to Aiyana. She stood there in her mockery of sacred clothing, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations. The easy choice was to nod, to continue the performance, to survive another day. But Cole's words echoed in her mind. Everyone has a choice. Slowly, deliberately, she began to remove the costume. The feathers fell to the floor like fallen leaves, and the beads scattered across the boards with tiny, clicking sounds. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she stripped away the degrading outfit, revealing the simple brown dress beneath. "What are you doing?" Thornton's voice cracked with fury. "Making a choice," Aiyana said, her voice stronger than she'd heard it in months. She let the last piece of the costume fall from her hands. "I won't dance for you anymore." The saloon erupted in chaos. Men shouted, chairs scraped against the floor, and the sound of gun leather being loosened filled the air. But Cole stepped forward, positioning himself between Aiyana and the crowd. "Anyone who wants to force her will have to go through me," he said calmly. Morrison laughed harshly. "You against 20 men? Even Cole Harrison ain't that good with a gun." "Maybe not," Cole admitted, "but I'm not talking about guns." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm talking about Apache Canyon, about what really happened there, about why the army discharged me without honor, and why some of you can't look me in the eye." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different, heavy with secrets and shame. Aiyana watched the faces around her change, saw knowledge and guilt flicker across features that had been twisted with cruel pleasure just moments before. "You weren't there," Thornton said, but his voice had lost its edge. "I was there," Cole replied. "I guided the cavalry to that village. So I told them it was a war party's camp. I was wrong." He looked around the room, meeting each man's gaze. There were no warriors there, just old men, women, and children, and I watched good soldiers become murderers because they believed what I told them. Sarah Mitchell, the town's schoolteacher, had appeared in the doorway sometime during the confrontation. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes that took in the scene with growing understanding. "Dear God," she whispered, "that's where she came from, isn't it? Apache Canyon." Cole nodded grimly. "Her grandmother was among the dead. She was taken during the aftermath." The piano music stopped abruptly as the player's hands fell from the keys. The only sounds were the desert wind whistling through the bat-wing doors and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere in the darkness beyond town. Aiyana stared at Cole with new understanding. This was the man who had led the soldiers to her village, who had inadvertently caused her grandmother's death. Yet he was also the man who had just risked his life to defend her dignity. "So what now?" Thornton asked, his voice hollow. "Now," Cole said, "we make things right. Or as right as we can." He held out his hand to Aiyana, not demanding but offering. She looked at it for a long moment, then at the faces surrounding her. For the first time in 3 months, she saw something other than hatred and superiority in their eyes. She saw shame, confusion, and perhaps the beginning of something that might one day become conscience. She took his hand. The hand that took Cole's was calloused from months of scrubbing floors and washing dishes, but it trembled with something more than fear. It shook with the unfamiliar weight of defiance. Aiyana had forgotten what it felt like to make a choice that mattered, and the sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. "You're making a mistake, Harrison," Thornton said, his voice low and dangerous. "This town's got a long memory, and we don't forget those who turn against us." "I'm not turning against anyone," Cole replied, his grip on Aiyana's hand steady and reassuring. "I'm trying to turn towards something better." The saloon's patrons shifted restlessly, caught between their ingrained prejudices and the uncomfortable truth Cole had forced them to confront. The revelation about Apache Canyon had shattered their simple narrative of good versus evil, leaving them adrift in a grey world where heroes and villains weren't so easily defined. Sarah Mitchell stepped further into the room, her schoolteacher's instincts overriding her fear. "Mr. Thornton, surely we can find a better solution than this." She gestured toward the scattered costume pieces on the floor. "This isn't who we are. This isn't who we're supposed to be." "This is exactly who we are," Thornton snapped. "We're survivors. We're the ones who tamed this land, who built civilization out of desert and death. And we did it by being stronger than the savages who tried to stop us." "By being crueler, you mean?" Cole said quietly. "There's a difference." Morrison stepped forward, his blacksmith's arms crossed over his broad chest. "You got a lot of nerve, Harrison, coming in here and preaching to us about cruelty. You're the one who led the cavalry to that village. You're the one with Apache blood on your hands." "You're right," Cole admitted, and the simple honesty of it seemed to surprise everyone in the room. "I am. Every day I wake up with that blood on my hands, and every night I go to sleep with their voices in my ears. But that's exactly why I can't stand by and watch this happen again." Aiyana watched the exchange with growing understanding. The white man's guilt was real, but it wasn't the patronizing pity she'd expected. It was something deeper, a recognition that the cycle of violence and dehumanization had to stop somewhere with someone. "So what do you propose?" Thornton asked. "We just let her walk away? Forget about the debt she owes?" "What debt?" Sarah Mitchell's voice was sharp with indignation. "What could a young woman possibly owe for being dragged here against her will and forced into servitude?" "The debt of her people," Thornton repeated, but the words sounded hollow now even to him. "Her people." Cole's voice hardened. "You mean the old woman who was shot down while trying to protect her granddaughter? The children who were killed before they could even understand what was happening? Those people?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the piano player had shrunk back into the shadows, unwilling to be associated with the confrontation unfolding before him. Aiyana found her voice again, surprising herself with its strength. "My grandmother never killed anyone. She was a healer, a keeper of stories. She taught children how to find water in the desert and which plants could cure sickness. The only debt here is the one you owe to her memory." "Savage lies," muttered someone from the back of the room, but the words lacked conviction. "Are they?" Cole asked. "How many of you have actually talked to her? How many of you know anything about her beyond what you've assumed?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Aiyana realized that in 3 months of captivity, not a single person had asked her name, her history, or anything about her life before they'd made her their dancing toy. "Her name is Aiyana," Cole continued. "It means eternal blossom in Apache. She was learning to be a medicine woman when the cavalry came. She speaks 4 languages, including better English than half the men in this room." "How do you know all that?" Thornton demanded. "Because I asked," Cole said simply. "Because I remembered seeing her in the camp before the shooting started. Because I've been carrying her face in my nightmares for 3 months. The admission sent a ripple of discomfort through the crowd. Several men began to edge toward the door, suddenly eager to be anywhere else. "This is touching," Thornton said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But it doesn't change anything. She's still property of this establishment, and she'll work until her debt is paid." "No," Sarah Mitchell said firmly. "She won't." All eyes turned to the schoolteacher, who had drawn herself up to her full height, despite barely reaching Cole's shoulder. "I'll pay whatever debt you claim she owes. Right now. In cash." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "You don't have that kind of money, schoolmarm." "I do." Sarah reached into her reticule and pulled out a small cloth bag that jingled with coins. "I've been saving for a new schoolhouse, but this is more important." "How much?" The mayor's face went through several expressions as he calculated. The amount he named was outrageous, more than most men in town made in 6 months. But Sarah didn't flinch. "Done," she said, counting out the coins onto the nearest table. "There's your debt, paid in full." The sight of the money seemed to break something in the room's atmosphere. The abstract concept of ownership suddenly became concrete, reducible to cold metal coins scattered across scarred wood. "You're all making a mistake," Thornton said, but his voice had lost its authority. "This won't end well for any of you." "Maybe not," Cole admitted, "but it's ending better than it started." As the crowd began to disperse, some men leaving with shame-faced hurry, while others lingered as if uncertain what to do next, Aiyana felt a strange sensation in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope. "Thank you," she said quietly to Sarah, who was gathering up her empty coin purse. "Don't thank me yet," Sarah replied. "Paying your debt is the easy part. The hard part is what comes next." "What do you mean?" "I mean you're free now, but you're still in Deadwood Creek. There are people here who won't forget what happened tonight, and they won't forgive it either." Sarah's eyes were kind but realistic. "You'll need protection and you'll need somewhere to go." Cole, who had been watching the last of the crowd file out, turned back to them. "She's right. Thornton's not going to let this slide. He's got too much invested in keeping the old order intact." "Then what do we do?" Aiyana asked. "We get you out of town," Cole said. "Tonight, if possible. I know people in Tucson who can help you get back to your people, if that's what you want." Aiyana considered this. The idea of returning to the Apache filled her with longing, but also with uncertainty. After 3 months of captivity, she wasn't sure she knew how to be free anymore. "I need time to think," she said. "That's one thing we might not have," Cole replied grimly, "but we'll figure something out." As the 3 of them stood in the now empty saloon, surrounded by the detritus of the evening's confrontation, Aiyana felt the weight of possibility settling on her shoulders. For the first time in months, tomorrow wasn't a certainty of humiliation and survival. Tomorrow was a question mark, and that made all the difference. The desert night wrapped around Deadwood Creek like a dark blanket, broken only by the yellow glow of oil lamps, flickering in windows, and the distant howl of wind through the canyon walls. Aiyana sat on the narrow bed in Sarah Mitchell's small house behind the schoolhouse, staring at the simple cotton dress the teacher had given her, clean, modest, and free of the stains and tears that had marked her captivity. "The men will be watching the main roads," Cole said from his position by the window, where he'd been keeping vigil for the past 2 hours. "But there's an old mining trail that heads north through the rocks. It's rough going, but it connects to the stage route about 20 miles out." Sarah poured coffee from a dented pot, her movements efficient despite the tremor in her hands. "I have a small wagon. It's not much, but it could get you to the stage stop." "And then what?" Aiyana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question had been haunting her since they'd left the saloon. Freedom was a gift she'd dreamed of, but now that it was within reach, she felt paralyzed by the vastness of possibility. "Then you choose," Cole said simply. "You could go back to your people if that's what you want, or you could start over somewhere else. There are Apache communities in New Mexico that might welcome you, or you could try to make a life in one of the bigger cities where your past wouldn't follow you. Would it be that easy?" Aiyana stood and moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. "To just leave all this behind?" "Nothing about this is easy," Sarah said gently, "but that doesn't mean it's impossible." They were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Cole's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but Sarah raised a hand to stop him. "It's probably Mrs. Henderson from next door. She saw the lights and—" The door opened before she could finish, and Mayor Thornton stepped inside, flanked by Jack Morrison and 2 other men. All were armed, and their faces wore the grim expressions of men who'd come to settle accounts. "Good evening, folks," Thornton said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "Lovely night for a gathering, isn't it?" "Get out of my house," Sarah said, her schoolteacher's authority evident despite her obvious fear. Now, Miss Mitchell, we're just here to talk." Thornton's eyes found Aiyana, and she saw the cold calculation there. "We've been thinking about tonight's transaction, and we've decided there might have been some irregularities in the paperwork." "What kind of irregularities?" Cole asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Well, it seems the girl's debt was more complicated than we initially calculated. There were damages to property, cost of housing, medical expenses from when she first arrived." Thornton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid Miss Mitchell's payment, generous as it was, doesn't quite cover everything." "That's a lie," Sarah said flatly. "Is it?" Morrison stepped forward, his bulk filling the small room. "Because I remember having to fix a broken chair after she threw one of her tantrums, and Doc Peters charged the town for treating those cuts she gave herself when she first got here." Aiyana felt the walls closing in again. She'd known this moment would come, the moment when the brief taste of freedom would be snatched away. But something had changed in her during those hours of sitting in Sarah's kitchen, drinking coffee and talking about possibilities. The defeated girl who had danced for their amusement was gone, replaced by someone who remembered what it felt like to have choices. "I didn't break any chair," she said, her voice steady, "and I didn't give myself those cuts. Your men did that when they dragged me from the wagon." "Your word against theirs," Thornton said dismissively. "And whose word do you think carries more weight in this town?" "Mine," said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Dr. Peters, the town's physician, standing in the entrance with his medical bag in hand. He was an elderly man with kind eyes and a reputation for speaking his mind regardless of consequences. "I was wondering when you'd get around to mentioning my supposed charges," he continued, stepping into the room. "Funny thing is, I never submitted any bill for treating Miss— What did you say her name was?" "Aiyana," Cole said quietly. "Miss Aiyana. I treated her injuries the night she arrived, and I can tell you they weren't self-inflicted. They were consistent with someone who'd been roughly handled during transport." Dr. Peters looked directly at Thornton. "And I never charged the town a penny for my services." Thornton's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "There are still other expenses?" "No," Aiyana interrupted, surprising everyone, including herself. "There aren't." She stepped forward, and for the first time in months she held her head high. "I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to pull me back into that cage because you can't stand the thought of losing control. But I won't go back." "You don't have a choice," Morrison growled. "I do have a choice," Aiyana said, her voice growing stronger. "I have the same choice you had when you decided to turn a grieving girl into your entertainment. I have the same choice you had when you forced me to mock my ancestors for your amusement. I have the choice to say no." The room fell silent except for the wind outside and the distant sound of horses moving through the streets. Thornton's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. "You think you're free?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. You think paying off some made-up debt changes what you are. You're still Apache. You're still a savage. And this town has a long memory for those who forget their place. Then maybe it's time for this town to learn a new way of remembering, Dr. Peters said firmly, because I was here when the first Apache delegation came to negotiate peace 5 years ago. I was here when we turned them away with rifles instead of words, and I was here when the consequences came back to haunt us. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on each man in turn. We created this cycle of violence, gentlemen. We fed it with our fear and our hatred, and now we have a chance to break it to show that we can be better than our worst impulses. Pretty words, Doc, Thornton said, but they don't change reality. She's coming back with us, one way or another. No, Cole said quietly, she's not. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison and the other men shifted nervously, their hands moving closer to their weapons. But Cole remained calm, his eyes fixed on Thornton. This ends here, Cole continued. Tonight now she's free and she's staying free. You're 1 man against 4, Thornton pointed out. 5, Dr. Peters said, moving to stand beside Cole. 6, Sarah added, though she looked terrified. 7, came another voice from the doorway. They turned to see Tom Bradley, the town's telegraph operator, standing in the entrance. He was a thin, nervous man who usually avoided confrontation, but his face was set with determination. I heard what happened at the saloon, he said, and I've been thinking about it all night. My daughter's the same age as her. He nodded toward Aiyana. I can't stand by and watch this happen. One by one, other townspeople began to appear in the doorway. The baker, the stable owner, even some of the younger men who'd been in the saloon earlier. Not all of them, but enough to change the balance of power in the room. Thornton looked around at the growing crowd, his authority crumbling with each new arrival. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, Aiyana said, her voice carrying the weight of her ancestors' strength. It is. As Thornton and his men reluctantly retreated into the night, Aiyana felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the solid ground of community beneath her feet. Not the community of shared hatred that had imprisoned her, but something new, fragile, and precious. So what now? She asked. Cole smiled for the first time since she'd met him. Now we figure out what comes next. Together. Outside, the wind had stopped, and the desert night was filled with the sound of possibilities. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at Sarah's house, and Deadwood Creek had settled into an uneasy peace. The morning sun painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber as Aiyana worked in the small garden behind the schoolhouse, her hands gentle with the tender shoots of corn and beans she'd planted, using seeds Dr. Peters had somehow procured from a Navajo trader. The town had changed, though not everyone was happy about it. Thornton still held his position as mayor, but his influence had waned considerably. Several of his most vocal supporters had quietly distanced themselves after that night, unwilling to be associated with what many now saw as a shameful chapter in the town's history. The children are asking about you again, Sarah said, emerging from the schoolhouse with a bundle of papers in her arms. They want to know if you'll tell them more stories about desert plants. Aiyana smiled, wiping dirt from her hands on the apron Sarah had given her. Which plants do they want to hear about today? The healing ones, I think. Young Billy Morrison cut his hand on a rusty nail yesterday, and his mother is worried about infection. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Jack Morrison's son was now benefiting from Apache knowledge, even as his father remained sullenly opposed to Aiyana's presence in town. But children, Aiyana had learned, were more adaptable than their parents. They saw her not as a symbol of conquest or guilt, but as someone who knew interesting things about the world around them. I'll prepare some willow bark extract, Aiyana said, and some sage for cleaning the wound. But Dr. Peters should look at it too. Of course. Sarah paused, studying Aiyana's face. You know you could leave any time you wanted. Cole's offer to help you reach your people still stands. It was a conversation they'd had several times over the past weeks. Cole had made it clear that he felt responsible for helping her return to the Apache, if that's what she chose. He'd even made contact with some of his former colleagues who could arrange safe passage to the reservations in New Mexico. I know, Aiyana said quietly, but I'm not sure that's what I want anymore. The truth was more complicated than she could easily explain. The months of captivity had changed her, carved away parts of who she'd been while forcing her to discover strengths she hadn't known she possessed. The girl who had lived peacefully in the mountains with her grandmother was gone, but the woman who had taken her place was still figuring out who she wanted to become. Have you talked to Cole about it? Sarah asked gently. Aiyana felt heat rise in her cheeks. Her relationship with Cole had evolved into something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't romance. The gulf between their backgrounds and the weight of their shared history made such feelings seem impossible. But there was a connection there, forged in the crucible of that night in the saloon and strengthened by the weeks that followed. "He says the choice has to be mine," she replied, "that he owes me the freedom to decide without his influence. And what do you think?" Before Aiyana could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A small group of riders was making its way down the main street, and even from a distance, Aiyana could see they weren't typical visitors to Deadwood Creek. Their posture, their dress, the way they sat their horses, everything marked them as Apache. "Oh my," Sarah breathed. Cole appeared from around the corner of the schoolhouse, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, but his expression alert rather than hostile. He'd been helping repair the school's roof, one of many small acts of service that had gradually earned him acceptance in the community. "You expecting company?" he asked Aiyana, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The riders drew closer, and Aiyana's breath caught in her throat. The leader was a man she recognized, Chief Delshay, her grandmother's cousin, and one of the most respected elders among her people. Behind him rode 3 younger warriors, their faces painted for travel but not for war. The small group stopped in front of the schoolhouse, and for a long moment nobody spoke. The tension wasn't hostile, but it was heavy with the weight of unspoken questions and unresolved grief. "Aiyana, granddaughter of Walking Moon," Chief Delshay said finally, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ceremonial speech. "We have come to bring you home." The words hit her like a physical blow. Home. For months that concept had seemed like something from a dream, as distant and unattainable as the stars. Now it was being offered to her by a man who had known her since childhood, who carried the authority of her people and the love of family. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Word travels on the wind," Delshay replied cryptically. "We heard that the granddaughter of Walking Moon had been taken, and later that she had been found. We came to see if the stories were true." Cole stepped forward, his movements careful and deliberate. "Chief Delshay, I'm Cole Harrison. I know who you are," Delshay interrupted, but his voice wasn't unkind. "You are the scout who led the horse soldiers to our village. You are also the man who has protected our daughter when she needed protection." The acknowledgement hung in the air like smoke. Cole nodded slowly, accepting both the accusation and the recognition with equal dignity. "I can't undo what I did," Cole said, "but I've tried to make amends where I could." "The grandmother of this child was a wise woman," Delshay said. "She taught that the circle of revenge must be broken somewhere by someone. Perhaps you are part of that breaking." Aiyana felt tears burning her eyes as she looked between the 2 men, one who had inadvertently destroyed her old life, and one who represented the possibility of reclaiming it. Both had traveled long distances to be here. Both carried burdens they couldn't set down. "I need time to think," she said finally. Delshay nodded as if he'd expected this response. "We will make camp by the creek. We will wait 3 days. After that we must return to our people." As the Apache riders moved toward the edge of town, Aiyana noticed that several townspeople had gathered to watch the proceedings. Some faces showed fear or suspicion, but others reflected curiosity and even respect. Tom Bradley tipped his hat to Chief Delshay as he passed, a small gesture that would have been unthinkable just a month ago. 3 days, Sarah said softly. "That's not very long to make such a big decision." "Maybe it's long enough," Aiyana replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it. That evening, as the sun painted the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Aiyana found herself walking toward the creek where the Apache had made their camp. She'd changed from her simple cotton dress into the traditional clothing Dr. Peters had quietly acquired for her, a gesture of respect that hadn't gone unnoticed. The camp was small but orderly, with a fire burning low and the horses grazing peacefully nearby. Chief Delshay sat beside the flames, working on a piece of leather with patient precision. "Come, sit," he said without looking up. "Tell me about this place, about these people who have given you shelter." Aiyana settled beside him, watching the flames dance in the gathering darkness. "They're not what I expected," she said finally. "Some of them are exactly what I thought, cruel, ignorant, quick to hate what they don't understand. But others—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Others are trying to be better than their fears. And the man Harrison? He carries great guilt," Aiyana said carefully. "It has changed him, maybe broken something in him, but it has also made him determined to prevent more harm." Delshay nodded thoughtfully. "Guilt can be a teacher. if a man is willing to learn from it. He looked up at her for the first time. "What has this place taught you, granddaughter?" The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Aiyana considered all the possible answers. About resilience, about the complexity of human nature, about the possibility of finding dignity even in the darkest circumstances. "It has taught me that home isn't always a place," she said finally. "Sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes it's the people who stand with you when you need to stand up for yourself." Delche smiled, and for a moment she saw her grandmother's expression reflected in his weathered features. "Your grandmother would be proud of the woman you have become," he said. "Whatever you choose, know that you carry her wisdom with you." 2 days later, Aiyana stood again in front of the schoolhouse, watching as Chief Delche and his warriors prepared to depart. Her decision had surprised some and disappointed others, but it felt right in a way that settled deep in her bones. "You're sure about this?" Cole asked one final time. "I'm sure," she replied. "This is where I'm needed now. There are children here who need to learn that Apache knowledge isn't something to be feared or mocked, but something that can help them survive in this land. There are adults who need to see that understanding can exist between our peoples." Cole nodded, accepting her choice with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. "What will you do when the next group of travelers comes through? When someone recognizes you from before?" "I'll tell them my story," Aiyana said simply. "All of it. The parts they want to hear and the parts they don't. And I'll hope that hearing it helps them see the world a little differently." As the Apache riders disappeared into the desert haze, Sarah emerged from the schoolhouse, with her afternoon class of children trailing behind her. Among them was Billy Morrison, his bandaged hand healing well thanks to Aiyana's plant medicine, and several other youngsters who had overcome their parents' prejudices to accept this new teacher, who knew different things than anyone else in town. "Miss Aiyana," called out young Emma Bradley, "will you show us the plant that makes purple dye? Mama wants to know for her weaving." "Of course," Aiyana replied, leading the children toward the garden where her heritage and her future grew side by side in the desert soil. Behind them, Cole began hammering new boards onto the schoolhouse roof, each strike of his hammer a small act of building rather than destroying. And in the distance, the wind carried the sound of possibilities across a land that was slowly, carefully learning to see itself with new eyes. The story that had begun with forced performance in a saloon had become something different. A tale of choice, of dignity reclaimed, and of the hard work of building understanding across the chasms carved by history. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that made all the difference.